Hi, I'm Chris Bretherton. I'm a trauma orthopedic registrar from Oxford in the UK, and I'm coordinating the Major Trauma Priority Setting Partnership with Xavier Griffin from London, and in collaboration with the James Lind Alliance and the Orthopedic Trauma Society, and funded by the AOUK, which is a trauma education and charitable organisation. And this sort of 10 to 15-minute presentation will give an overview of what it involves. So some of you will be familiar with this slide, which gives an overview of the Priority Setting Partnership or PSP process and what being part of the steering group involves. The key points are that this is not about doing an individual research study, but it's about trying to decide what questions are important to patients and healthcare professionals and should be prioritized for future research. There are some short videos you can watch on the JLA website about the overall JLA process, but the main role of the steering group members is to attend video conferences every 2 to 3 months over an 18-month period, and to help steer and guide the project and reach as many patients and healthcare professionals as possible along the way. Though you don't need to attend all the meetings, particularly if it's 1 a.m. in the morning where you are, which I know is the case for a few of you. So this presentation over the next 10 minutes is just going to cover other prioritization exercises and how this one fits in, a little bit about how research is funded in the UK, the international plan, and then the sort of scope of this work. So I know some of the steering group members have contributed to either one of these. I know there are other ones going on, but I'm just going to briefly mention these two. So the trauma priorities in sub-Saharan Africa, that was done in collaboration with the AO Alliance, including public health measures. So this JLA PSP, we're not planning on considering public health measures for a reason I'll mention a bit later. And while some of the clinical questions may overlap, each question really needs to be applicable to the UK population. So it's a bit blurry, but 4.34 here talks about the best way to treat femur fractures. But the key is that's in a resource limited setting. So that wouldn't be applicable for this priority setting partnership. And I'll explain a bit why that is later. And some of you may have been involved in this major trauma Delphi, and that gathered lots of questions with a good number of responses from healthcare professionals, and it was very broad, all brain injury, rehabilitation, all sorts of aspects of major trauma. But again, I'm going to explain a bit later why this one is perhaps less likely to influence funders than the plan that we have for this JLA PSP, and therefore why we're undertaking it. So how research is funded. So the National Institute for Health Research, or NIHR, is the main government body for clinical research in the UK. And now patient and public involvement is a crucial part of any NIHR research. And the James Lind Alliance, or JLA, priority setting partnerships are the gold standard and NIHR endorsed method for prioritizing research questions or topics. And so any form of grant application can reference a JLA PSP, but there are specific ones that directly offer funding for JLA top 10 questions that once they've been produced, and these are efficacy and mechanism evaluation, which is sort of early to medium phase clinical trials. There's the health and social care delivery research, which is about delivery and organization of care. Health technology assessment is usually looking at big, large scales clinical studies assessing clinical and cost effectiveness of treatments. And then there's public health research also. And therefore, the JLA Major Trauma PSP is perhaps more focused on these funding streams, and so, it's more clinical than perhaps lab-based or microscope or early sort of genetics work. But again, it could be covered, as I'll mention. So the sort of international plan, that the reason we're sort of encouraging this is, to obtain the necessary sample size of patients to do a clinical study in researching major trauma would likely need to recruit from multiple countries. Now, this is likely to be via paired grant funding via the North American and Australian and etc. National Institute for Health funding. Now, I don't know what value these countries' NIHs place on patient and public involvement, but it's likely at least at some point to follow the UK model and have a high priority and high interest in it. But there are several examples of JLA PSPs which are specific to Canada, to the Netherlands, to Germany, to Sweden, and to Australia. Alternatively, even if certain international funding bodies do not recognize the JLA as their gold standard method for prioritization, the fact that there may be a multi-million pound UK study already running that they can simply bolt onto and add their country, for a fraction of the cost, that's likely to be an attractive prospect to any funding body. And here's just an example of how that has worked for a study involving broken bones around the elbow and the forearm, and how that's got international funding and is being delivered internationally. And very sorry if any of these hats offend you. And really, that's the reason we wanted to have international steering group, really so that we can reach an international body of healthcare professionals and patients, and they can get to contribute to deciding what these research priorities are, really, getting you on the elevator at the start rather than partway through. So this is the proposed scope, and what it is, it's designed to mirror the NICE guidance for major trauma. And so NICE is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and it makes recommendations for care in the UK. There are around 350 sets of guidance, but these points on the left are the ones that are referenced in the major trauma guidance. So about when someone's suffered major trauma, how should they be triaged? Where should they be managed? It talks about the pre and in-hospital management of their airway, their breathing, blood loss, reducing heat, pain, as well as support for their families, and looking at how national audit systems might be able to merge and help research. Now, as you can see, there are some exclusions here, and I'm going to go on and explain why we've suggested these exclusions, but they are not set in stone by any means, and that's all up for discussion. So why are we suggesting the exclusions? That's because most JLA PSPs try to have a very discrete focus or scope. Otherwise the uncertainties and questions that they gather are too broad, they're too generic, or ultimately they don't help funders or researchers decide what is important. Now there's a list of current and previous PSPs on the JLA website, and there's over 100 currently on there. And I selected just examples of a few just to show how specific they can be. There's not just one for diabetes, there's one for type 1 and type 2, and for diabetes in pregnancy. There's not just one for inflammatory bowel disease, there's one for inflammatory bowel disease in Australia, pediatric inflammatory bowel disease, and then also one specific to digital technology for adolescent inflammatory bowel disease. And similarly, for hip and knee arthritis and knee replacements, there's 4. So in fact, it may be better to talk about, or to rename the title of this PSP to the Major Trauma Assessment and Initial Management, but that's something that we can discuss at the steering group meeting. And so this here is why we've suggested we limit the PSP to pre and in-hospital management, really because there are separate NICE guidance that could deliver a separate PSP on, for instance, managing post-traumatic stress disorder or rehabilitation after critical illness. And it's also quite a lot of overlap with the complex fractures one, which I'll show you in a minute. You also might be surprised that we've suggested excluding head injury and spinal cord injury. Again, that's because there's been 2 PSPs on spinal cord injury, and there are 2 NICE guidance specific to spinal injury and to head injury and their early management. So some of you will have been involved in the complex fractures PSP, and here's a reminder of the top 10 questions that came up, and you can see that there is a major focus on outpatient sort of rehabilitation and expectations, and giving high quality long-term information for patients. And that's because the scope of that PSP was included the first 12 months from injury. So to avoid too much overlap, we are suggesting just looking and asking questions for the pre-hospital and in-hospital treatment of major trauma. But that wouldn't necessarily exclude, a similar psychological question such as, from who and when should patients receive a psychological assessment after major trauma. That's just an overview of the PSP, and it gives some background as to why we have suggested certain things and the scope of it. But again, this is all open for discussion. It's just a preliminary offering. And here are some pictures that I found that we might want to include in the survey. And we'll all get a chance to have a chat and vote on what ones we want to include, if any. So thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again on Monday, the 6th of December. Bye for now.